In this episode of The Christian Philosopher, we'll talk about the principle of causality. Welcome back, everyone. Scott Sullivan here from the Aquinas School of Theology and Philosophy. Today we're talking about the principle of causality. Why? Well, I've been doing a series of videos on how to prove that the world was created. I offered 4 arguments in prior videos, and you can check that out. The point of those arguments, it was 4 arguments to show that the universe began to exist, that the physical changing material world, all the stars and the atoms and everything, at one point had a beginning. It doesn't go back forever. So all that stuff began to exist. And then I want to say after that if it began to exist, it seems like it needs a cause, right? Isn't that just kind of intuitively obvious, right? Whatever begins to exist has a cause. That's one formulation of what is known in philosophy as the principle of causality. Ex nihilo nihil fit, they would say in Latin. From nothing, nothing comes. Whatever begins to exist has a cause, or being comes from being, you see. This is the principle of causality. It has many formulations, and it's just kind of a common sense intuition in all of us. If we were sitting around in the living room drinking coffee and you hear bang in the other room, right? You go, what was that? Oh, it was nothing. No one says that. You know what I mean? Things that begin to exist have a reason. They have a cause. That's just a common sense intuition that all of us have, although some people want to get a little resistant to that if you start talking about using that principle and applying it to the existence of God. Atheists want to get a little nervous. Oh, I don't know. Maybe something can pop into existence out of nothing. They want to start playing funky with that principle when you start using that in an argument for the existence of God, even though, everybody accepts it, in everyday life. You'd be crazy not to. So it seems obvious that things just don't pop into existence without some cause. And honestly, when you look at philosophers throughout the history of the Western tradition, most of them just took this idea as obviously true. It didn't even need any proof. Parmenides and so many of the great Greek philosophers and so on, it was just self-evident, at least in some sense, to think that whatever begins to exist has a cause. So most philosophers, didn't think that they needed to prove this, but there have been a minority of philosophers who want to call it into question. Why? Well, I told you why I think it is, but in any case, they kind of want to wonder, well, how do we really know that? How do we really know that things just can't pop into being uncaused out of nothing? How can we prove that statement? Well, I will tell you that I personally have been very interested in this question, so much so that I did my doctoral work in philosophy on this question, and I wrote a whole book on it. This is St. Thomas Aquinas and the Principle of Sufficient Reason. We'll talk about the Principle of Sufficient Reason a little bit later in this video, but that's kind of an overall encompassing version of the Principle of Causality. And if you want to know more about that, you can read my book. It's 220 pages of pure philosophical insight into the Principle of Causality, Principle of Sufficient Reason, where I defend this whole thing. Okay, so this was my doctoral dissertation that turned into a book, but I'm not, of course, going to go into all of that here. But what I do want to do in this video for all you people online out there, I do want to give you just kind of a brief defense of this principle. And if you need more, you can check out the book. I want to argue that this principle is true. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Whatever begins to exist, has a cause. And I think this principle of causality is true. How do we know that? I'm going to give you 3 arguments or 3 defenses for this principle. Argument number 1 we'll call the argument from intuition. Number 2 is the argument from inductive reasoning. And number 3 is the argument from the principle of sufficient reason. All right, so let's take the first argument, the argument from intuition. What do I mean here? By intuition, I just mean kind of a direct knowledge of something as obviously true without needing any further proof or evidence. That you're watching me on a video right now is self-evident. It's intuitively obvious. You know, you know this by intuition, by just direct experience. How do you know that? Because you're watching me on a video. You don't need any other proof than that. That's what I mean here by intuition. It's just kind of self-evident in the sense that it just seems so obviously true that you don't need another argument for it. And there are a lot of things we know like this. For example, that I have thoughts. I have thoughts. How do I know that? It's intuitively obvious. Or that I can sense the external world. That the world wasn't created 5 minutes ago with an appearance of age. Or a lot of other things as well. You know what I mean? There are a lot of things that we know just through this sort of direct, intuitive, obvious sort of knowledge that where we don't need any further proof. We all believe things like this. We all believe that there's an external world. You know, we all believe that we have thoughts. We all believe that the world was not created 5 minutes ago with an appearance of age. How do we know these things? Intuition, intuitive knowledge. It's an important part of what we know. You don't just give arguments and proofs for everything. That sort of process has to stop at what we call first principles, and some of those are this sort of direct knowledge, intuitive sort of knowledge that I'm talking about here. All right. So I think the principle of causality, whatever begins to exist has a cause, is at least obviously true in this same way. And at least this is the way, like I said a while ago, many philosophers in the history of the West have taken the principle to be true in this sense, okay? And honestly, also like I said before, the truth of the matter is most people really don't have a problem with it, you know, in normal everyday speak. They don't have a problem believing this principle, whatever begins to exist has a cause, in their normal life unless they're trying to be argumentative. You know, I just think there's a little bit of intellectual dishonesty going on when people call this principle into question. And so to those people, you know, if you're watching this video and it's not obvious to me, okay, well, to those argumentative types, I think we can say this, that it's certainly more probable, right, than not, that being always comes from being, okay? Even if you weren't sure, you know, what would you say if I put a gun to your head and say, which way is it? Do you think this is always true or not? I mean, come on. You know, let's be serious here. Okay, so I think it's just reasonable to think on this argument from intuition that whatever begins to exist has a cause. The next argument is the argument from inductive experience. All of our experience as human beings seems to confirm this principle, right? I mean, we never just walk down the street and see things just popping into existence uncaused. That never happens. We have a lot of inductive, empirical verification of this principle in our everyday lives all the time. All of our experience confirms this. We don't just see like a monkey or a grapefruit or a Ford truck just popping into the room uncaused. These things don't happen. So this sort of inductive experience, all of our experience over time, collectively too as human beings and individually, it at least tells us that it's at least probably true, right? That out of nothing, nothing comes. Ex nihilo nihil fit. In other words, all of our common experience tells us that in each and every case, being comes from being. All right, next is the argument from the principle of sufficient reason. So in my book here, I'm arguing that the principle of causality, whatever begins to exist has a cause. It's actually kind of a sub-principle of a larger and necessary principle we call the principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason says every being has a reason for its existence. Every being has a reason for its existence, either in itself or from another. That's the principle of sufficient reason. Every being, doesn't matter what it is, has a reason why it exists, either in itself or in something else. So, in other words, whatever exists has some kind of reason, has some reason, something that makes it distinct from nothing, something that makes it distinct from just mere possibility. I think possibility has a certain reality. I'm not going to get into that right now. But everything that exists, this book, this water jug, whatever, this microphone, everything has a reason why it exists, either in itself, it has something in itself that makes it distinct from nothing, or something else did that. Okay? There could never be something that didn't fall under the principle of sufficient reason. What there could never be, in other words, is a being that exists but has nothing in virtue of which it is distinct from nothing. Can't possibly be. To say that a being exists but has nothing that makes it exist, either in itself or something else, right? Nothing in virtue of which it is distinct from nothing, is to utter a contradiction. That would be to say that this thing exists but has nothing that makes it distinct or different from nothing. Right? It both exists and is identical to nothing. This is utter nonsense. And I think denying the principle of sufficient reason, in other words, lands you in contradiction. And if you want more about that, you can read my book. But the argument here is that the principle of sufficient reason is necessarily true. It cannot be denied without denying the principle of non-contradiction, in other words. So it's metaphysically necessary, in other words. How does this apply to the principle that whatever begins to exist? Well, quite simple. It's quite simple. Take for example, the world. We talk about the world had to begin to exist, right? If the world began to exist, then at one point, the world didn't, right? At one point, the world was in a possible state. It could exist, but it didn't. That has to be true. And then so you have the world was in kind of a possible state. It didn't exist, but could. And then it was in an actual state. It really did. It went from could existing to actually existing. Possible to actual. Right? Two different things there, two different possibilities. What made the difference? What made the world different from its mere, when it became actual, what made it different from its mere possible state? There must be a difference. The difference is either something or nothing. If it's nothing, there is no difference, which is purely absurd. The actual world and the possible world, there's no difference. Clearly there is one, right? Clearly there is a difference between a possible $100 and an actual $100, right? If you don't believe that, try paying your bills with possible money. Okay, so there's a $100 difference. All right. So to say that there's no difference, would be to say that they are identical, but clearly that's impossible. The possible world cannot be identical to the actual world. So if something made those two states different, that something is either the world itself or something else. That's what the principle of sufficient reason says, right? This is exhaustive. There's nothing else in the world than this water thing right here, this water mug, or something else, right? It's exhaustive. But the possible world itself, that's not what made the difference. Clearly, the possible world by itself didn't have what it takes to exist, because at one time it didn't. It would have to be something else that makes the difference. Something else made the actual state different from the possible state, and that's what we call a cause. A cause. A cause is what made the existent world different from its mere possible state or nothing, however you want to think about it. So that's how the principle of sufficient reason works here. There must be some kind of principle of selection here, in other words. Whatever comes into existence has a certain equal possibility of existing or not existing. You can think of it as like a scale. A lot of philosophers like Avicenna, they talk about this scale, or Leibniz too, talk about a scale. It has to tip it, something has to make it tip towards one side or the other, or else it wouldn't be. So that's the argument from principle of sufficient reason. And so what these three arguments tell us about the principle of causality is this, that being comes from being. Right? Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Out of nothing, nothing comes. There are all these different formulations of the principle of causality, and I think these arguments can show us that this principle is true, and I've argued it's necessarily true. And if you want more on that, you're going to have to read the book, okay, my book. But my point here in this video, I'm not going to get into all that. My point here in this video is that there are good reasons from both common sense and philosophy to think that things can't just pop into existence uncaused out of nothing. Number one, the principle seems intuitively obvious. It's confirmed all the time in our experience, and there are strong philosophical reasons to show that popping into existence uncaused out of nothing is impossible because it violates the principle of sufficient reason. And at the very least, I think what all these arguments do is that they show the principle is true and at least put the burden of proof on anyone who wants to deny it. You think something can pop into existence uncaused? Man, the burden of proof is on you to show that. Otherwise, I think we've got good reasons to think that the principle of causality is true.